The B-17 bucked violently, throwing Captain James Rourke against his straps. Alarms blared as red lights flashed across the instrument panel, the roar of the engines drowned out by the percussive thump, thump, thump of flak exploding all around them. His co-pilot yelled something lost in the chaos, pointing at a gaping hole in the wing. They were flying blind into a wall of German anti-aircraft fire, a death sentence for the 10 men aboard the Lucky Lass. Rourke gripped the yoke, his knuckles white, knowing his next decision would either save them or seal their fate. He saw a break in the clouds, a path no one was supposed to take, a path that led away from the mission and into the unknown. It was a choice between certain death and a sliver of a chance, a choice that would change the air war forever. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The air in the Nissen hut was thick enough to taste, a foul cocktail of stale cigarette smoke, damp wool, and the nervous sweat of 50 young men trying to pretend they weren't afraid of dying. A large map of Northern Europe dominated one wall, its surface a spiderweb of grease pencil lines and notations. A single, angry red string was stretched taut across it, marking the deadly direct route from their base in England to the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory in Bremen, Germany. Captain James Rourke, who at 24 felt ancient, traced the line with a finger that didn't quite tremble. He could feel the immense, crushing weight of his crew's lives settling onto his shoulders. A familiar pressure that had become a permanent part of him. He was a quiet man by nature, and in these moments the silence within him was a fortress against the rising tide of fear he saw in the eyes of the men around him. He observed the nervous tics, the forced laughter, the way a pilot from another crew stared at the red string as if it were a hangman's noose. Colonel Hayes, the commanding officer, stood before the map, his posture as rigid as the discipline he enforced. His voice was a low growl, a gravelly rumble that cut through the low murmur of the room. "This isn't a sightseeing trip, gentlemen," he began, his eyes sweeping over them, seeming to pause on each face for a fraction of a second too long. "Your target is the Focke-Wulf plant at Bremen. We knock it out. We shorten this war. It's that simple. But the route is hot. Intelligence expects heavy resistance from the Dutch coast all the way to the target. You stick to the flight path, you hit the target, and you come home. Any deviation is an invitation to the devil." He let the words hang in the smoky air, a clear and unambiguous threat. Rourke saw his navigator, Lieutenant David "Davy" Chen, make a small, almost imperceptible adjustment to his glasses. Davy was meticulous, a brilliant mind trapped in a perpetually anxious body, and he was constantly checking his charts, his calculations, his reality. From a few rows over, a voice carried, just loud enough to be intentional. "Hope Rourke's compass works today. Wouldn't want him getting lost on the way to the party." It was Captain Donovan, a rival pilot with a reputation for being a glory hound. He was leaning toward his own co-pilot, a smirk playing on his lips. Rourke didn't react, his gaze remaining fixed on the map, but he felt a familiar flicker of irritation. Donovan flew his plane like he lived his life, loud and reckless, and he saw Rourke's quiet professionalism as a weakness. Davy leaned closer to Rourke, his voice a worried whisper that was for his skipper alone. "The flak corridor over the Dutch coast looks heavier than they're letting on, Skipper. The projections are bad. We'll be exposed for a full 12 minutes. Rourke gave a slow, deliberate nod, his eyes meeting Davy's. "I know, Davy. Just keep us true." It was his mantra, the simple phrase he used to reassure his navigator and himself. In his mind, he saw the faces of his crew's families, their wives and mothers, and he felt the weight of the silent promise he had made to each of them. A promise to bring their boys home. The scraping of chairs on the wooden floor signaled the end of the briefing. The men filed out, the scratchy wool of their uniforms seeming to amplify the tension, the taste of bitter coffee still on their tongues as they walked out into the cold, damp English morning, the smoke from the hut hanging in the air behind them like a shroud. The 4 Wright Cyclone engines of the B-17, affectionately named the Lucky Lass, roared to life in a deafening chorus. The entire fuselage vibrated, a living thing thrumming with power and anticipation. In the cockpit, Rourke's hands were steady on the yoke, his movements economical and precise as he and his co-pilot, Frank Rizzo, went through the final pre-flight checks. The dialogue was clipped, professional, a familiar ritual that settled the nerves. Oil pressure is good. Flaps set. Controls free and clear. Over the intercom, the voices of the crew chimed in, each man in his position, a link in the chain of survival. Sergeant Mike Gallo, one of the waist gunners, had a booming voice that even the intercom couldn't fully contain. "Hey, Frankie, you say a prayer for us?" Frank Rizzo, a man whose faith was as much a part of him as his Brooklyn accent, chuckled. "Already did, Mike. Said one for the plane, too. This old girl needs all the help she can get." Rourke felt the plane lurch forward as he released the brakes, and the Lucky Lass began its thunderous journey down the runway. He pushed the throttles forward, and the roar intensified, the vibration running through the metal floor and up into his bones. He felt the tail lift, then the main wheels. A familiar and exhilarating surge of power as they broke free from the earth. He looked out his window at the vast formation of bombers assembling in the gray English sky, a swarm of silver insects climbing against a backdrop of bruised-looking clouds. The English countryside shrank below, a patchwork of green fields and tidy villages that seemed a world away from the hell they were flying toward. The nervous energy of the briefing room had burned away, replaced by a focused adrenaline. Rourke felt a profound connection to the machine around him, to the 10 men who had placed their lives in his hands. He was their captain, their leader, their only hope. The formation crossed over the North Sea, a churning expanse of gray water under a gray sky. As they neared the enemy coast, the weather worsened, just as the forecasters had predicted. Dark, turbulent clouds rose up to meet them, swallowing the bombers in their disorienting embrace. Then came the flak. The sky, which had been a uniform, monotonous gray, suddenly erupted in hundreds of black puffs of smoke, each one a tiny, deadly flower blooming in the air. Orange flashes dropped inside the clouds, and the plane was rocked by violent explosions. The Lucky Lass shuddered and groaned, the percussive impacts of shrapnel against the aluminum skin sounding like a hailstorm of steel. "They weren't kidding about this corridor," Frank yelled, his eyes wide as he scanned the chaos outside. Rourke fought the controls, the yoke bucking in his hands as he tried to hold their position in the formation. Suddenly, a much larger impact, a violent, jarring slam, struck the side of the cockpit near the navigator's station. A piece of shrapnel the size of a fist had hit the fuselage, not penetrating fully, but sending a shock wave through the aircraft that rattled everyone's teeth. "Everyone okay back there?" Rourke called into the intercom, his voice tight. A series of affirmative, if shaken, replies came back. Davy, however, was frantic. "Skipper, I've lost our position. The compass is spinning. That last hit—" He pointed a trembling finger at the magnetic compass, its needle swinging wildly, useless. The electrical chaos of the flak bursts combined with the shock of the impact had thrown his delicate navigation tools into disarray. At the same time, the dense clouds closed in completely, reducing visibility to near zero. The lead bomber, their only visual guide, vanished into the gray abyss. Rourke had a split second to make a choice. He could try to climb above the storm and the flak, but that would make them a solo target, silhouetted against the clearer sky above. Or he could dive and change course, a desperate gamble to find the formation again, on the other side of the squall line. Frank's voice was strained. "I can't see a damn thing. Where's the lead?" Rourke's mind raced. "Stick to the path," Hayes said. The colonel's gruff voice echoed in his memory. What path? Rourke thought, his jaw clenched. The one that leads straight into that wall of steel? He saw a brief, almost imagined break in the clouds to his left, a slightly less dense patch of gray in the swirling madness. It was a gut decision, a pilot's instinct overriding the rigid orders of the briefing room. "Hold on," he said, his voice calm and authoritative despite the storm raging inside and out. "I'm taking us left. Davy, do what you can to get a fix, anything." He banked the plane sharply, pulling the Lucky Lass out of the formation and into the unknown, a solitary silver ghost plunging deeper into the storm. For a few terrifying minutes that stretched into an eternity, the Lucky Lass was a toy in the hands of the storm. It was tossed and battered, the groans of its metal frame a constant agonizing symphony. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, they flew out of the storm front. The violent bucking ceased, the air smoothed, and a brilliant, blinding sunlight flooded the cockpit. The percussive rhythm of exploding flak was gone. replaced by a sudden, profound silence that was somehow more unnerving than the noise had been. The only sound was the steady, reassuring drone of their 4 engines, now seeming incredibly loud in the sudden peace. Rourke blinked, his eyes adjusting to the light. The sky ahead was a vast, empty expanse of the deepest blue he had ever seen. It was clear, but it was empty. There were no friendly bombers, no enemy fighters, nothing but the glint of the sun on the metal of their own wings. The crew, who had been braced for impact, slowly relaxed their bodies, but their minds remained on a razor's edge. Over the intercom, Mike Gallo's voice was a low, tense rumble. "Where did they go? It's quiet. Too quiet." The sentiment rippled through the crew, a shared wave of paranoid unease. A trap. It had to be a trap. They were being lured into something, drawn into a clear patch of sky where fighters could pick them off at their leisure. "Everyone stay sharp," Rourke ordered, his own voice tight as he scanned the horizon, his eyes searching for the black specks of enemy aircraft. "Eyes open, this could be a trap." In the navigator's station, Davy was working frantically, his hands a blur of motion over his charts and instruments. He ran diagnostics, checked his equipment, and took readings, his brow furrowed in a mask of intense concentration. After several long minutes, he looked up, his face pale with confusion. He unstrapped himself and stumbled into the cockpit, holding a flimsy piece of paper with scribbled calculations. "Captain," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "this is impossible. According to the scope, there are no radar signatures. None. It's like we vanished off the face of the earth." Rourke felt a knot of pure dread tighten in his stomach. The crushing weight of being utterly lost, of being responsible for the lives of 9 other men, pressed down on him with physical force. He had gambled, and now he feared he had lost. Frank Rizzo, his face slick with sweat, scoffed at Davy's report. "Vanished? What are you talking about, Davy? That shrapnel must have fried your gear. There's no way we're invisible." He pointed out the window at the serene landscape slowly drifting by thousands of feet below. "We're in the middle of Germany, for crying out loud. We need to turn back, find the formation, before they send a search party for our wreckage." Davy shook his head, his conviction overriding his usual anxiety. "The gear is fine, Frank. I've run diagnostics 3 times. It's working perfectly. Look," he said, spreading a chart across the space between the pilot's seats. He pointed a trembling finger at the red line, marking their intended route. "The flight path was designed to take us on a straight line between the known radar stations, Alpha 3 and Gamma 9. We should be lit up like a Christmas tree on their scopes right now. But when you banked left, you took us south. Way south." His finger traced their new unplanned trajectory. "And here," he tapped a blank area on the map, "there's a gap, a dead zone. I've never seen anything like it in the intelligence reports. It shouldn't exist." The debate raged in the cramped cockpit, a microcosm of the war itself, a battle between fear and data, between conventional wisdom and a new, terrifying possibility. Frank's arguments were rooted in the brutal logic of their reality. A gap in the German air defense network? The most sophisticated network in the world? No way. "It's a malfunction, Davy. We turn back now. We might make it. We keep going. We're flying to our own funeral." Davy's voice grew stronger, his belief in his readings absolute. "If we turn back, we go right back into the wall of fire we just left. I can guarantee that. If we go forward, I don't know what will happen, but it's clear right now. We are not being tracked." Rourke listened, his gaze shifting from the fear in Frank's eyes to the fierce, data-driven conviction in Davy's. He trusted his co-pilot's instincts, but he trusted his navigator's mind. He had seen Davy perform miracles of calculation under pressure, had watched him guide them through impossible situations with nothing but his charts and his intellect. This was the ultimate test of that trust, the story's pivotal leadership moment for Captain James Rourke. He looked at the empty sky, then back at the chart. He was the captain. It was his call. He chose to trust his crewmen. "We press on," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Stay this course. Let's see where it leads. Frank, you're on watch. Call out anything, even a seagull." Frank stared at him for a long moment, his expression a mixture of disbelief and insubordination, before he finally gave a curt, angry nod and turned back to the window, his jaw set like stone. The decision was made. The lucky lass flew on. a lone silver ship sailing into a sea of mystery. They flew for nearly an hour, the steady drone of the engines the only sound in a world that had gone silent. The tension in the aircraft, which had been a palpable living thing, slowly began to ease, replaced by a creeping sense of awe and disbelief. They were deep in enemy territory, flying a straight, predictable course, and yet the sky remained empty. No flak blossomed in the air around them. No fighters rose from the green fields below to challenge them. They were, for all intents and purposes, invisible. The crew, who had been scanning the skies with paranoid intensity, began to talk more, their voices filtering through the intercom, filled with a hushed wonder. The young tail gunner, a kid from Ohio named Bobby, was the first to put it into words. "Skipper, you should see this," he called out, his voice cracking with youthful excitement. "It's beautiful. We're just sailing." Rourke allowed himself a small, fleeting moment of relief, a tiny fraction of the weight lifting from his shoulders. But his mind was racing, churning, trying to understand the whys of it all. This wasn't luck. This was a phenomenon, a flaw in the system, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that it was their only way home. "Davy," he said, his voice low and urgent, "I want you to log everything. Every heading, every change in altitude, every minute. Note the time, the landmarks, anything you can see on the ground. If we make it back, they're going to want to know how." While Davy meticulously recorded their impossible journey, Rourke found his own mind drifting. He thought about the maps back at the base, with their confident red strings and their neat circles of projected danger. He thought about Colonel Hayes and the unwavering certainty of the planners who sent men to their deaths based on those lines. He was beginning to realize that maps were just theories. Elegant and logical, but theories nonetheless. They were flying through the brutal, messy reality, and the reality was that the map was wrong. He reflected on the impossibly thin, arbitrary line that separated a fatal error from a brilliant discovery. If he had turned right instead of left, if he had tried to climb instead of bank, they would be a smear of burning metal on the Dutch coast. But he hadn't. And now, because of a gut decision made in a moment of pure chaos, 10 men were still alive. The German landscape unrolled beneath them, a patchwork of forests, fields, and small villages that looked peaceful and serene from this height. The sun created long shadows that stretched across the countryside, and for a moment, Rourke felt as if they were in a private bubble, completely separate from the war. Observers in a world that didn't know they were there. They never made it to Bremen. With their fuel gauges dipping precariously low, and the target now hundreds of miles off their new course, Rourke knew they had no choice but to turn for home. The decision was a bitter pill to swallow, a clear failure in the eyes of the command. They had not accomplished their mission, but they were alive. "Take us back, Davy," Rourke said quietly, "exactly the way we came." Using the meticulous logs Davy had kept, they retraced their path through the strange, invisible corridor. The journey back was just as unnervingly quiet as the journey out. The crew remained on high alert, but the expected attack never came. As they crossed the English Channel and the white cliffs of Dover appeared on the horizon, a collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the plane. They were home. They landed at the base hours after the rest of the group was scheduled to have returned. As the Lucky Lass taxied toward its hard stand, the ground crew and base personnel who were still out on the tarmac stopped what they were doing and stared, their faces a mixture of confusion and shock. They were looking at the plane as if it were a ghost. The official window for returns from the Bremen mission had closed over an hour ago. Any plane not back by then was listed as missing, presumed lost. The Lucky Lass was the last one back, a ghost returning from the grave. Rourke brought the plane to a halt and went through the shutdown sequence, the roar of the engines dying one by one until a profound silence fell over the cockpit. The crew disembarked, their bodies heavy with exhaustion, their faces pale and drawn, but they were walking, breathing, alive. They were met not with the cheers and backslapping that usually greeted returning crews, but with confused, suspicious stares. And waiting for them on the tarmac, standing with his hands on his hips and his face like a thundercloud, was Colonel Hayes. He strode toward them, his boots crunching on the gravel, his eyes blazing with fury. "Rourke!" he barked, his voice carrying across the airfield. "Where in the hell have you been? You missed the target, you abandoned your formation. You have a hell of a lot of explaining to do." Rourke, too tired to be intimidated, too drained to be anything but honest, met the colonel's glare without flinching. He felt his crew gather behind him, a silent wall of support. "We survived, Colonel," he said, his voice raspy but steady. "And we found something. Let me show you the logs." He held out the papers Davy had given him, a testament to their impossible journey, a map of a path that wasn't supposed to exist. Colonel Hayes's office was small, cramped, and smelled of stale pipe tobacco and righteous indignation. The air was thick with accusation, a palpable force that pressed in on Rourke and Davy as they stood before the colonel's imposing oak desk. With hands that were surprisingly steady, Davy laid out his hand-drawn charts, the flight logs, and the pages of meticulous calculations. The papers represented their survival, the data-driven proof of their impossible journey. Hayes, however, barely glanced at them. His eyes, cold and hard as chips of granite, were fixed on Rourke. "A gap?" he said, his voice dripping with scorn. "A safe corridor? Or maybe, just maybe, you lost your nerve, Captain. You saw the flak, you felt the heat, and you decided to take your boys on a little joyride south to save your own skin." He leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his desk. "You abandoned your formation, you failed to deliver your payload. You are lucky, son, that I don't have you court-martialed for cowardice right here and now." From a chair in the corner of the room, Captain Donovan, who was waiting for his own debrief after his plane had limped back with significant damage, let out a low, cynical chuckle. "Sounds like you got lucky, Rourke," he drawled, a smug smirk spreading across his face. "Some guys have all the luck." The comment was a spark on dry tinder. Rourke, who had been holding his anger in check, felt it flare. He stood straighter, his gaze unwavering as he met the colonel's. "With all due respect, sir," he said, his voice low but firm, "luck didn't fly that plane for over an hour through the heart of enemy territory, without a single scratch. Luck didn't keep us invisible to their radar. Lieutenant Chen's data is accurate. We found a hole in their net, and 10 men are alive right now because of it, not because of luck and not because of cowardice." Davy, who had been shrinking under the colonel's glare, looked up, his face a mask of dejection. His careful life-saving work was being dismissed as fantasy, his calculations treated as the ravings of a madman. Hayes waved a dismissive hand, his mind already made up. He picked up the stack of papers, not to read them, but to dump them unceremoniously into a wire basket on the side of his desk marked "Pending." "Get out of my sight, both of you," he growled, his voice a low threat. "I'll decide what to do with you and your fairy tale later." Rourke and Davy turned and walked out, the weight of injustice heavier than any fear they had felt in the sky. In the outer office, a woman in the uniform of the Women's Army Corps, Major Evelyn Reed, looked up from her paperwork as the two dejected airmen passed by. She had overheard the entire exchange through the colonel's partially open door, and one phrase had snagged her attention, pulling at her with an intellectual curiosity that bordered on obsession. "Radar dead zone." Major Reed was an intelligence analyst, a woman whose mind worked in patterns and probabilities. And for months, she had been nursing a pet theory, a quiet hypothesis that the much-vaunted German radar grid was not the seamless, impenetrable shield that High Command believed it to be. She had seen too many fragmented reports, too many anecdotal accounts from pilots who had been briefly lost, only to reappear unscathed to believe it was perfect. Rourke's story, dismissed as cowardice by Hayes, sounded to her like a confirmation. Once Hayes had left for the evening, his anger still radiating from his empty office, Evelyn walked in. She retrieved Rourke's logs and Davy's charts from the pending basket, rescuing them from their ignominious fate. Spreading them out under the dim light of her own desk in the analysis room, a cavernous space filled with maps, aerial photographs, and the quiet hum of calculating machines, she saw not a fairy tale, but a meticulous, detailed, and internally consistent set of data. She saw the navigator's precise time-stamped entries, the steady compass headings, the notes on ground landmarks, and the unwavering reports from the radio operator of absolute radio silence. This wasn't the work of a man in a panic. This was the work of a professional. Evelyn spent the entire night working, fueled by black coffee and a rising sense of excitement. She began a painstaking process of cross-referencing. She took the coordinates from Davy's chart and plotted them on a massive topographical map of northern Europe. She then overlaid this with the Allied intelligence maps, showing the known locations and estimated ranges of every German Freya and Würzburg radar installation. Her pen moved swiftly, drawing circles of projected radar coverage, creating a dense, overlapping web of detection. For hours, the map only confirmed the official story, showing a solid wall of radar covering the approach to Bremen. But as she traced Rourke's southern deviation, she began to see it. It was a geographical anomaly, a subtle, winding valley that snaked between the mountains of the Harz region. The primary radar stations were positioned on the peaks to maximize their range, but their signals, she theorized, would shoot straight over the low-lying valley. The signals from the stations on the other side were blocked by the terrain itself. The two overlapping radar fields, which should have created a double-layered defense, instead created a blind spot, a narrow, winding path where the signals were weakest, a channel of electronic silence. She pulled fragmented reports from other lost planes, incidents written off as equipment malfunction or pilot error, and found a pattern. 3 other planes over the past 6 months had reported similar phenomena, all within the same general coordinates. A montage of her work unfolded under the single lamp illuminating her desk, her hands pinning locations, her slide rule flashing as she made calculations, her face a mask of intense concentration. Finally, as the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the window, the gap appeared on her map, no longer a theory, but a clearly defined, verifiable path, a thin, winding ribbon of safety through a landscape of death. The next morning, the main briefing room was buzzing. A group of high-ranking generals from 8th Air Force Command had arrived for a strategy meeting, and Colonel Hayes was in his element, all bluster and confidence. That confidence evaporated when Major Evelyn Reed, armed with her maps and a folder full of data, entered the room and requested permission to speak. Hayes tried to wave her off, but one of the generals, a man with a reputation for listening to his intelligence officers, motioned for her to proceed. Rourke and Davy had been summoned to the meeting, standing awkwardly at the back of the room, assuming they were there to be made an example of. They watched in stunned silence as Evelyn tacked her annotated map to the main board. "Colonel, gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and steady, projecting a confidence that filled the large room. Yesterday, Captain Rourke and his crew returned from the Bremen mission hours late, having missed their target. They were accused of cowardice. I am here to tell you that Captain Rourke did not get lucky, nor did he lose his nerve. She paused, letting her words sink in, her eyes sweeping over the assembled officers and landing for a moment on Hayes, whose face was slowly turning a shade of deep crimson. He stumbled upon a verifiable, and I believe, repeatable flaw in the enemy's detection network, a flaw that I have confirmed with our own signals intelligence and cross-referenced with topographical data and prior incident reports. She used a long wooden pointer to trace the winding path on her map. "We have been sending our boys through the front door," she said, tapping the red string that still marked the direct route to Bremen, right into a perfectly laid kill box. Captain Rourke, quite by accident, found the back door. The room was silent. The generals stared at the map, their expressions shifting from skepticism to intense interest. Hayes was stunned into a rare and complete silence, his mouth slightly agape as he stared at the evidence that so completely contradicted his own rigid worldview. One of the generals, a man named Thompson, stepped forward for a closer look. "Major," he said, his voice thoughtful, "if this corridor is real, it changes everything." He turned to his aide. "I want a reconnaissance flight scheduled immediately, a Mosquito. I want it to fly this exact route, both ways. I want to know if this back door is really unlocked." The reconnaissance flight, a stripped-down, high-speed de Havilland Mosquito, flew the next day. It screamed through the corridor at high altitude, its cameras clicking, its sensors recording. It returned without a single bullet hole, its pilot reporting an eerie, uneventful flight. The corridor was real. The very next day, the route was quietly incorporated into the mission, planned for a raid on a target near Hamburg. The bomber group was specifically instructed to follow the new winding path. They flew into Germany, dropped their bombs, and flew out. They suffered 0 losses to flak on the approach or the return. The second group to use the route a day later had similar miraculous results. Word spread like wildfire through the base. It started as a joke in the mess hall, a way to cope with the sheer improbability of it all. Pilots would raise their glasses and toast Rourke's route, the lucky joyride that turned out to be the safest road in Germany. The name stuck. It quickly lost its ironic edge and became a term of respect, of gratitude, of hope. Pilots from other crews would seek Rourke out, not to mock him, but to clap him on the shoulder. "We flew your route today, Captain," a young, fresh-faced pilot told him, his eyes shining with genuine awe. "It was like a walk in the park. You saved our skins today." Rourke, a man who shunned the spotlight, found the attention deeply uncomfortable. One evening, as he was walking back from the mess, Donovan fell into step beside him. The usual smirk was gone, replaced by a look of grudging respect. "Rourke," he said, not quite meeting his eyes. "About what I said in the colonel's office. I was out of line." Rourke just nodded, accepting the quiet apology. There was nothing more to say. The route spoke for itself. Weeks later, Rourke was standing by the runway, the English air cool and damp against his face. He wasn't flying today. His crew was on a well-deserved rotation, but he had come out to watch the bombers take off, a ritual he had developed. He watched as another wave of B-17s thundered into the sky, their silver bodies catching the morning light. He watched them form up, a great lumbering armada, and then he watched them turn, not towards the deadly coast of Holland, but south, towards the winding, invisible path in the sky that now bore his name. He felt no pride of ownership, no thrill of victory. He felt only a quiet, profound sense of relief that was so deep it was almost a physical ache. He thought about the hundreds, and soon to be thousands, of young men who would now have a chance to come home, to see their families again. All because of a moment of chaos, a faulty compass, and a single, desperate, accidental turn. The immense weight of responsibility he had felt for his own 10-man crew had transformed into something else, something different. It was the weight of a legacy he had never asked for, a legacy forged in fear and redeemed by data. The story would not end with him, the quiet captain who got lost. It would end with the image of those bombers, disappearing one by one into the vast horizon, following an invisible path, a path that was born from the moment one pilot was lost, and in being lost, found the way home for so many others.